So just a rough.
Well, here's me. Born December 31, 1931. Now, 89. Less than a year after my parents were married, right in the middle of the Depression, small country town. My grandfather had a farm, and it's quite a story about the grandfather and his father. And my father worked as a counter hand in a grocery store in this small country town. He was paid about £2 a week and had work once every second week because of the Depression.
One day every second week, or
1 week every second week. So things were pretty tight, pretty tough, but because the wedding gift from his father had been milk every day from the dairy that he hand milked himself, that helped. And he also was able to run a house cow on the town common, which was a common thing in country towns in those days. And his house cow was for the purpose of having more calves. And if it was a female, he'd then sell the cow and raise the calf as another breeder, and so on, which gave a little bit of income every year or so. He was able to sell the progeny, so that helped with the groceries. When I was 5, I had a sister born, Nan, 1936. And that was to be the finish of the family, but there was a slight accident about 1942, and there was a third child, Faye. The economy had improved a little bit. World War II broke out, and although it was unbeknown to any of us at the time, there was enormous government deficit spending to arm the army and pay them, bring women into the workforce, which had never been really done before. Although I had my father's sister was a highly qualified nurse, eventually worked for the Australian Inland Mission in Alice Springs, where she met a New Zealand miner and married him. The war took over everybody's lives, of course. And just before the end of the war, when I had 7 years of primary school, I had to go to boarding school because there was no viable way of getting any further education locally, because the daily train service to Dalby was no longer available, but my father had availed of to get his junior certificate. So I had to go up to boarding school. And from there, life took a different path.
so when you were growing up, what was the predominant idiom of the time? Just up to your time where you went to school and then went through school and left school, the time where you grew up, what was it like?
Well, the general environment that I recall was, first of all, my school teacher was a man called Eric Gillies, a fairly hefty sort of a guy. He was a Roman Catholic and he voted Labor. My father was Anglican and voted Country Party. But my father did respect him as a school teacher. He often said he was a very good teacher. He always got everybody through the necessary exams. So on that basis, I was decided that I should take careful notice of what the teacher taught. Unfortunately, he took an attitude to me because when I was a bit short of having learnt something that he wanted me to learn, I would get a hangdog look on my face, and I'd look down and look up at him. I'd lower my head and look up at him, and apparently he took that as a sign of belligerence or resentment, and I used to get the cane. Whenever I'd been chastised and took this attitude, I would get the cane. Well, I didn't realise until many years later that my sister, who was also then going to school towards the end of the war, said that I got the cane pretty well every day. And I hadn't realised that this was the environment of school that I was getting. I just did my very best at all times. Always tried hard at the behest of my parents. Always try your best, and you'll be as good as anybody if you try your best. You're always as good as anybody else around you. That was drummed into me right from the outset, so I always did my best. I passed my scholarship exam with about 98.5%. I eventually, years later, met a girl in Dalby who had got a higher percentage than me in her scholarship, and also got a higher percentage than me in the junior exam. That's another story. My parents were regular churchgoers. Probably there were two other families who used to go on at Easter and Christmas and any special occasions, but my parents went every month because the church was part of the Bush Brotherhood, as they called it. Headquarters were Dalby. There was a priest in charge who was an archdeacon and three other priests, and they would take it in turns. Once a month they'd come around and do the rounds, and we used to go to church. My father became the church warden. He also became the secretary of the race club for about 10 years. His father had always taken on a good attitude to public duty and had been a shire councillor for 30 years in the days well before politics. And he became a shire councillor because a couple of the local reasonably prominent, socially prominent people had asked him to do the job because they respected his attitudes. And he eventually became chairman for 2 terms of the Wombo Shire Council. So I had a family who had a reasonably good social responsibility approach to life. And that's the way I went off to boarding school.
What was life like in boarding school? Morals as well as churchy versus what you'd been grown up with.
Well, first of all, explain how you got there.
Well, my father decided there was no viable way of getting a further education, so he spoke to the archdeacon about Christmas time in 1944 and said, I need to send Trevor off to get some higher learning. And because I'd been an altar boy for the archdeacon at the local church, and my father had been a church warden, I think Archdeacon Knight had the notion that here might be a possibility of training a priest. Little did he know there was little chance of that, although I did have respect for the church. And he got in touch with Canon Morris, who was the founder of the Anglican Church Grammar School in Brisbane, and they made an exception to me and allowed me to come as a boarder to Churchie. And because of the delay and the arrangements that had to be specially made to get me there, I was a fortnight late when I arrived at Churchie, and I missed the inauguration and the first introductions by the various teachers to the various classes that were held. So I started a little bit behind, but I put my head down and decided to work hard, and I got quite good reviews, but within a month or so I had started to play around at the gymnasium on the weekend, and for some reason on the weekend the masters decided to take the rings off the Roman rings, and I was trying to do some somersaults off the rings without the rings, had a bad fall, broke my right arm, which formed an S bend, double break above the wrist, which kept me going back and forth to the doctor for weeks, and they had to re-break because it didn't heal straight. The doctor, when I first went into the doctor on the weekend, they found a doctor open, took me in to Norman Park, and he had a conversation with me while he was fondling the arm, and then all of a sudden grabbed both ends of the brake, pulled it apart and jammed it together, which was extremely painful. I just screamed. And then we found out later that it hadn't properly mated because there were splinters involved. So I spent a lot of time going to specialists up on Wickham Terrace, losing school while I did it, and then later on, 6 months later I suppose, during the winter, I caught a bad cold, didn't get over it, had my nose absolutely choked for weeks, and finally some of the teachers couldn't stand this dribbling nose and decided I should go up to the nurses, and the nurses were not properly trained. They were just friends of the headmaster. But I went off to a specialist once again, trips to the specialist twice a week, where he rammed a metal syringe up into the nose and broke through the bone behind the antrums and syringed the antrums out. This took several weeks, going twice a week, which once again I missed schooling, so I was well behind in my studies. Nonetheless, I managed to pass junior, which was a 2-year course in those days, so the following year, which was 1946, I passed junior, but not with the highest marks that I should normally have expected. And then I went on to do senior and never did catch up. And I lost confidence. I lost the ability to understand what the maths was all about. I was quite good at English. And when senior came, English was the only subject I passed at all. I got 27% doing junior French in senior. So in other words, I was scholastic disaster. I didn't expect ever, 30 years later, to go and pass a Mensa test and be admitted to Mensa. Had I known that earlier, I would have butted right in and decided to turn my life around, but I just started life and working life with very poor expectations of myself and very poor self-understanding of what I was capable of. And I just had to rely on my upbringing was to remember that as long as I did my best, I'll always be as good as anybody else.
So how did that experience influence your approach to self-teaching?
Well, I began to take an interest in things I was highly interested in, personally, and science was one of them. And sadly, about a year after I was married, high fidelity was the buzz. Technologically, everybody had to have high fidelity and the audio equipment. So I spent about 2 years building 2 high-end high fidelity sets, by which time technology had approached beyond high fidelity and into stereo, so it had all been a waste. That's the way life goes sometimes.
A little bit about how you met your wife and what precipitated the decision to go to Brisbane.
Well,
Was she the one that scored higher than you?
after I failed senior, my father had the sad task of trying to find me an occupation. But in the little town of Warra, there was an agency of the bank where they would come out twice a week just to service the local store, of which my father was by that time the manager, and the hotel and a couple of other businesses in town. So my father went and had a chat to the local manager who came out to serve that agency. They had become fairly friendly. And he said, "Do you think my son could get a job in the bank?" He did pass his junior, and he does have a senior standard exam education. And they said, "Oh yes, we'd be happy to have him." So I was enrolled to start in the bank. I was given my first job in Pittsworth, which meant I had to leave home.
How old were you there?
It was 1949, February the 14th, so I was 18, a couple of a few months. So I went off to Pittsworth, decided I was boarded with an old lady who had a spare bedroom, and the rent took up all my wages except for about 7 shillings and sixpence, for which I drew bought a malted milk every lunchtime. Joined the football club, but within 4 months the bank decided to transfer me back to Dalby. Possibly because I wasn't good enough for the local manager in Pittsworth. I don't know. But it was fine to get back to Dalby, where I boarded. Also took a lot of my wages just to pay for the board, but I was able to get home on weekends. My father, I would ride a bike to McAllister. He had bought a Chev Ute, so I could put the bike on the back of the Chev Ute. He would come and meet me in McAllister, and I'd go home for the weekends and be able to save a bit of money on having to buy meals for myself on weekends. But at that age, I used to go to the swimming pool because I had been in the swimming team at Churchy. I was in the 4x100 relay of the GPS, and although we broke the record, it was never in the record books because we only came second in the race, having beaten by 1/10 of a second by Nudgy. Another missed opportunity in life to have something not to boast about. But I used to go down to the swimming pool, and a mate of mine who worked in the bank about the same age as me, Jeff and I would go to the pool. He was keen on picking up the girls. And there was one girl, he came down and I thought was rather nice, shapely blonde, but she didn't come very often, which aroused my curiosity, so I began to ask a few questions. Oh yeah, that's Elsie. She doesn't come to the school much. She's a bit shy. And she used to get a little bit red around the eyes due to the chlorine in the pool, and that was one of the reasons why she didn't particularly like coming to the pool. But I asked her if she'd like to go to the dance. There's always a dance on pretty well every week. And she agreed to that, and before long we were regular. And we became more regular for the next
Define regular in that
5 years.
context.
Just going to dances.
Yeah.
Absolutely behaving ourselves in every way, physically and everything else, because her mother was, she had been a Sunday school teacher in the Anglican church, so I thought she'd be acceptable with my parents. This is pretty good. Her mother had been an Anglican also, but wasn't attending because she was thinking in other directions at that time, which I didn't know about. Anyhow, after 5 years, we decided it was time to become engaged. I waited until she was 21 because I didn't want to be accused of picking an underage girl and taking advantage of her. I decided we would wait until she was 21 and then we would get engaged. I wrote a letter to her father saying that, as you were aware, we had been close for some years. We have the greatest regard for one another, and I would be grateful for your permission to become engaged to Elspeth.
Your father.
He was greatly impressed by this letter. Such things were gone out of fashion about 20 years ago. But immediately I announced to the bank that we were engaged. The regional manager was coming by and he said, "Are you stupid? Don't you realise that if you're single, you're free to be transferred around Queensland and get wide experience in the bank, and you become far more useful to the bank and you're more likely to get good promotion if you stay single. I don't think you're wise." A fortnight later I got a transfer to the relieving staff. So that's how much the bank cared about my particular social welfare. I wanted to break it up as quickly as possible. However, within weeks, we got married in Toowoomba because it was between Dalby and Brisbane and everybody could get there. We had the reception in Russell Street. And between us, I think we had about £80 saved up. And with a discussion with my father, he said, "Well, you're going to be in Brisbane for a little while. You'll be based in Brisbane on the relieving staff, but you'll be based in Brisbane, and you've done a bit of relieving around Brisbane. The best thing to do would be to buy a house. I will lend you some money." So he lent me £1,000, which is about all he had. And we bought the house at 27 Pride Street, Campbell, which is a little 2-bedroom fibro house with a deep 6 fibro roof on a small allotment next door to a very religious Uniting Church couple and a tradesman and his wife and daughter on the other side. So it turned out we ended up living there for for 17 years through all sorts of changes in my bank career.
Right.